Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, available on YouTube and wherever you listen to your favourite podcasts. By the way, I love keeping the conversation going, so please connect with me across the social medias. Links in the description below. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Allan Zuckoff, a clinical psychologist and a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, or MINT. He's also the author of Finding Your Way to Change, a powerful guide for therapists and clients navigating the often complex landscape of personal transformation. Dr. Zuckoff has extensive experience working with motivational interviewing and the dynamics of ambivalence in the therapeutic process. In today's discussion, we'll talk about what ambivalence is, the thoughts and feelings that can go along with it, the discomfort that it can sometimes produce, as well as how we can get stuck. And we'll also talk about the real benefits of ambivalence, which I found eye-opening, and I hope you will too. And stay tuned to the end, where Allan gives us a few very practical steps that people finding themselves feeling ambivalent about something can take to guide them through this challenging yet productive space. I can't wait for this conversation to unfold. And so I bring you Dr. Allan Zuckoff. All right, so you ready to get started?
Sure, let's do it.
Excellent. All right. Well, Dr. Allan Zuckoff, thank you very much for coming and speaking with me on Compassion in a T-shirt.
It's my pleasure, Stan. Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. So I thought we'd start with the sort of the big question. What is ambivalence?
Right. Sensible place to start. So ambivalence, interestingly enough, it seems like a simple question. It's actually a little more nuanced than one might imagine. The basic definition of ambivalence is having conflicting evaluations of the same thing.
Right.
That's the traditional sort of research definition. So if I'm thinking about a change that I might want to make in my behavior, in my life, or I'm thinking about a person, or I'm thinking about an idea, uh, 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 or a political perspective, I can be ambivalent about any of those things because I have these two conflicting views or judgments or evaluations, essentially positive and negative at the same time. In some way, I'm drawn to it. I think it's good. It's something I might want for myself, or I might want to believe or draw close to it. At the same time, I also believe that it's something that I might not want to do or be. Um, well, what sort of needs to be added to that is that those evaluations come along with feelings. And
Mm.
so often when you hear people talk about ambivalence, what they'll say is it's feeling two ways about the same thing. And of course, it's really both. If I see something as a good thing, as something that I would like to be or do or move towards, I'm probably going to have certain feelings about that. Warm feelings, positive feelings, attraction, desire. But if I'm seeing it as something that I judge negatively, my evaluation is that's not a good thing. That's not something then of course I might be distrustful, angry, uncomfortable, and so on. So it's that combination of having those different feelings and thoughts at the same time about the same thing.
Mm.
Right?
Mm.
And what that, of course, results in is feeling torn and conflicted. And that's why ambivalence can be so troubling
Mm.
for us,
Yes.
because it's not just, oh, I think this and I think that, and isn't that interesting? It's, I want to move towards something, I want to have something, And at the same time, I don't want to have that, or I want something else, and I can't have both at the same time. And that conflict, that inner conflict or tension, is what creates the discomfort that people often associate with ambivalence.
Mm. Yeah, great. Okay. No, that's so it's sort of having different and even conflicting thoughts and feelings two ways about the same thing, and there is a discomfort that goes with that we have separate feelings or different feelings about the thing, but we also end up feeling something about the ambivalence itself, and the discomfort that arises there can sometimes be
Mm,
motivating too. You mentioned political ambivalence, for example, which is sort of a
mhm.
tricky topic at the moment in a way, but people will
Sure.
often feel the discomfort there and then they'll sort of just double down into one side to kind of remove that feeling of discomfort. And I suppose that's in a lot of change or ideas or actions that we might feel ambivalent about, there becomes a desire to remove that discomfort.
Exactly. Exactly. And the ways in which so I'll say two things. One is that, and maybe and we could talk about this, I hope, is that um, ambivalence, well, first of all, people vary in how uncomfortable ambivalence makes them, which is something I think that we hadn't maybe appreciated as much as we do now, thinking about within a motivational interviewing perspective, which is the perspective that, as you know, I sort of ground myself in, and that shapes a lot of my thinking and practice in helping people with ambivalence. It turns out that there is a personality characteristic known as preference for consistency,
Hmm.
and people can be high or low in this characteristic. So some people find it quite uh, um, sort of okay to be aware that they're feeling two ways about the same thing. It's not distressing or discomforting. It's interesting to them, or they think of it as an opportunity to do some more thinking or find out more about it, or see whether there's some way to bring the two together. In other words, very often when we're ambivalent about something is in the political area, as you mentioned,
Mm.
um, there's a tendency to fall into a very black and white kind of thinking about that, right? It's either this or it's that.
Mm.
And it's when things get framed that way, then we have to take sides. And it's that feeling of, if it's either this or that, then I have to take a side. Um, that drives me. That's when the ambivalence becomes really uncomfortable. I can't feel both ways about this. I have to feel only one way or the other. Um, but it actually turns out that that's not always true. Sometimes there's a way to bring elements of the two sides together in a higher order synthesis. Um, and that's what's known as dialectical thinking. And that term, the concept of dialectical thinking goes back to, in the Western philosophy, back to a philosopher named Hegel, and that, but we don't need to go there. But where it fetches up today is, so I'm sure you're familiar, and some of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with an approach to therapy known as dialectical behavior therapy, and it's the same idea that instead of getting caught in black and white thinking and either or thinking, in feeling like I have to either choose this side or that side, we can begin to think dialectically. We can start to ask, what are some of the elements of this side that I like and don't like? And are there elements of that side? And is there a way I can bring this together so I'm not on one side or the other? So I don't have to choose exactly.
Mm.
Um, And people, some people find that relatively easy to do. For others of us, and I'm not a natural dialectical thinker, so I'll put myself in that camp. For others of us, it's a skill we have to actually learn,
Mm.
and something that it's really helpful to be aware of, that when we notice ourselves falling into the either or, black and white, to kind of catch ourselves. Oh, wait a minute. Is it really those? Are those my only choices? Or is there another way to think about this?
Mm.
So there is that variability in how people experience ambivalence, especially when they first become aware of it. Right? So at some point we become ambivalent. If we're in a relationship or in a job, or we're drinking or a certain way, or we're smoking cigarettes, or we're being comfortably sedentary, or whatever else we're doing, or at moments we get really super angry and maybe vent our anger in ways that other people get uncomfortable with. At some point, we kind of felt like I'm okay with it. I know it's not really hurting anybody. It's not really hurting me. It feels like it gives me something. And then somewhere along the way, sometimes because we ourselves begin to think, wait a minute, I'm not so sure how this is really how I want to be, or the choice I want to be making. And sometimes, of course, it's other people who are kind of giving us messages like, this is not okay. That's when ambivalence may begin, where instead of being perfectly satisfied with feeling one way about what I've been doing, now I start to feel two ways, or I start to see two judgments. I think it's okay, or maybe it's not okay.
Mm.
And what happens when we first become ambivalent actually turns out to be a really important um, determinant of how likely we are to get stuck in the ambivalence. Because if once we're stuck, nobody who's stuck in ambivalence doesn't feel uncomfortable. So ambivalence may be more or less uncomfortable at first for different people. But if we get to the point where we feel like I'm stuck in it, I've been ambivalent about this, and I'm trying to decide what to do or which direction to go, and I can't. At that point, it's uncomfortable for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is so interesting, Alan, and it sort of starts to shake up a little bit some of how we think about ambivalence more traditionally, I guess, in MI, and
Yeah.
there's sort of this preference for consistency is kind of on a continuum for people, and people who are high
Mhm.
on preference for consistency, I guess, can fall into that sort of either or type of thinking about something, more black and white, and perhaps
Mhm.
feel like they have to, kind of be definite or certain about things. Whereas people who are perhaps lower on that preference for consistency are a little bit more both and about things. That they're able to hold that space of both things being kind of possible. And I don't know, in some ways, the idea in MI has been to resolve ambivalence, explore and resolve ambivalence. And sometimes
Mhm.
MI practitioners might even interpret that as we've got to get to a certainty or something, or we have to discover, no longer feel both and, but instead feel one way or the other. So just talk a little bit about that in terms of MI and where it's come from or how it's been interpreted around ambivalence.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So you use the term uncertainty, which I think is a really important and really accurate sort of a term for us to use, because it turns out that alongside that preference for consistency characteristic that people vary on, there's another characteristic that's known as tolerance or intolerance for uncertainty. And they are probably correlated, but they probably kind of go together, but they're not the same thing. Um, and intolerance for uncertainty originally was identified in work with people who are struggling with anxiety disorders, most especially generalized anxiety disorder, which is a condition where a person finds themselves worrying not just about one thing or a couple of specific things that are, maybe genuine sources of threat or danger for them, but worrying about many different things and unable to stop themselves from worrying, sometimes even when they might rationally think to themselves, this is really, I don't really need to be so worried about this, but there's this sense of almost needing to worry and worrying all the time. And it can be quite, as you can imagine, quite a difficult way to live. And alongside that, the other condition, which is called obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a condition in which people, obsessions are thoughts that intrude into our mind, often get irrational, often recognized as unrealistic and irrational. But a person with this condition can't tolerate the uncertainty of knowing, I think it's irrational, but I'm not 100% sure that it's irrational. And that triggers a compulsion. The compulsion is an attempt to soothe or ease the anxiety associated with the obsession. And it turns out that people with both of these conditions are high in this characteristic that's known as intolerance of uncertainty. That was the original fun, but then researchers continued to explore it, and it actually turns out that it's a much broader phenomenon. It's not only confined to people with these kinds of specific conditions. It's a personality trait, a dispositional characteristic that we can be high on and low on. And for folks who have a very difficult time tolerating uncertainty, there tends to be a tendency to get drawn into rumination, thinking about the same things over and over again, trying to solve unsolvable problems, trying to reach 100% certainty about a choice or a decision, or about whether something is true or not, or whether I should believe it or not. And the problem with that, and this gets back to your point about where that term resolving ambivalence can be a little tricky, is that there's a well-known quote from a Danish philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard that basically is reduced to: life must be lived forwards, but it can only be understood backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Which unpacked means we can't, no matter how hard we try, we can't be certain, right, that we're making the right decision about anything, right? We can do a lot of work and come to have a sense of strong belief, a sense of confidence, a feeling that, yes, this is what's right for me. This is the direction I want to go in. It feels good. It feels like it's consistent with who I want to be, how I want to live. We can have all that, but we can't be 100%. And the only way we'll finally know if we were right or wrong is when we look back after having made the decision and ask ourselves, now, was it the right one or not? And this is part of the human condition. This is one of the hardest things about the human condition. So the things we're talking about, this is not about psychopathology. It's not about anything wrong with anybody. If you're human, this is what you live with, right? And so because of this, and because we know that once we make a choice, we can't unchoose it. Once we make a choice, we will have to give something else up, right? If I choose this direction, then I can't choose any of these other directions, at least not in the moment. And even if I could go back maybe and try to re-choose it, it won't be the same decision. So we don't know for sure. We face options. We have to choose one. And we won't know until after we choose it, if it was the right one. So it's not easy being a person,
Yes,
as I
exactly.
know in the world of compassion focused therapy, and self compassion is sort of a core realization
It
that
is.
we want to help people grasp. And this is one of the things that's really hard about being
Mm.
human, is not knowing for sure. And so if we think that resolving ambivalence, helping people resolve ambivalence, means we're going to help them get to the point where they're 100% certain of that they do want to make this change, right? Not only are we never going to get there, but because we can't get there, maybe in a moment we may feel, I'm sure that this is the right thing. We may have moments like that, but in the bigger picture, we're never going to be completely free of doubts or uncertainties or questions or awareness of maybe the benefits of the other choice. Not only will we never get there, but in fact, the pressure we start to place on ourselves to try to be 100% certain, or if as a practitioner, we think our job is to keep exploring, resolving ambivalence until the person has no doubts at all, no interest in or tendon, not aware of any cons of the change or any benefits. We're going to miss the moment. We're actually going to hold the person back from being able to move forward with a sense of, I believe I feel good about this choice. It feels like the right choice to me, and I'm ready to make a commitment to it.
Mm.
There's a phrase that I love that one of my grad school professors introduced me to, and I won't say how long ago that was, but it comes from Gordon Allport, American psychologist who used to be very well known. He's kind of faded a little bit into obscurity,
Mm.
but some of us, still value his work. His phrase was, he said, commitment is really a kind of a wager.
Ah,
We can be half sure and wholehearted.
yes.
If we wait until we're 100% sure, we'll never act,
Hmm.
or we'll only act because in some way we're deceiving ourselves. We're managing to kind of push out of our mind any doubts or uncertainties. And the one thing we can always count on is if we pushed something away, sooner rather than later, it's going to creep its way back, right?
Mm.
So we can't, we have to be accept that we can only be half sure. But if we're half sure and half-hearted, we won't
Mm.
succeed at change. Because if we're thinking about a change, especially making a change in our behavior, whatever it might be, I want to drink less or exercise more or be kinder to other people or kinder to myself, or whatever the change is we're thinking about, if if we begin trying to make that change with only a half-hearted commitment, the likelihood that we're going to succeed is very small,
Mm. Mhm.
right? Because change is hard.
Mm.
If
Mm.
if it was easy, we would have already done it, right? We wouldn't have sought out a counselor or someone or support or help in figuring out what do we really want to do and how do we do it. And since we're going to encounter obstacles, and we know we will, if our commitment is only half-hearted, that's when we'll almost certainly get discouraged.
Mm.
The thing that allows us to carry through, to get through the obstacle, the hurdle, when we see the hurdle, that helps us do what's needed to get over it, is having the wholehearted commitment to whatever it is we're trying to accomplish.
Mm.
So I think
Yes.
it's that
Mm.
interesting sort of paradox of half sure and wholehearted that um, that's what it really means to resolve ambivalence, I think, is
Hmm.
to get to that place.
Mm. Yes, I mean, in a way, commitment itself is dialectical in a sense. It's sort of those two things operating at the same time, half sure and wholehearted. Both and in a sense. And
Mhm.
it strikes me that when people are facing change, they are underneath all of that is these kind of preference for consistency, and the tolerance or intolerance for uncertainty, and
Mhm.
they're grappling with all of that, and there's sort of therefore ambivalence feels uncomfortable at different levels, and so on. But the MI practitioner too is a human being and comes along with their own preferences for consistency and tolerance of uncertainty, and so that can
Most
then have little
definitely.
little influences on how they approach the conversation too,
Yeah.
and on both sides of the conversation. I'm not sure, but it's like a tolerance for ambivalence almost that we're
Mhm.
both having to practice there.
Exactly, exactly. That captures it perfectly for me. It's tolerance for ambivalence, and can we help people tolerate ambivalence so they can benefit from ambivalence?
Ah,
Um,
that was my next
so,
lot of
so
questions.
yeah. So let me take one step back, and then we'll go the step into that.
Yeah.
So because I want to I want to sort of not neglect. I said earlier, if once we get stuck in ambivalence, it's always uncomfortable,
Mm.
and I think often the stuckness in ambivalence comes from how we respond to ambivalence as we first encounter it. Right? So, if we realize I'm not sure what to do here, I'm feeling torn, and it feels uncomfortable to us, or we feel like I don't really want to be in this place, we can fall into a cycle that can trap us and make it much harder to find our way forward. Um, and the cycle is sort of comprised of first, if we're feeling uncomfortable or anxious or distressed by realizing that we feel two ways about something, or that we don't know what we really want to do in this situation, or what the right choice is for us. And one of our most natural tendencies is just to try to avoid it, right? To just
Mm.
put it out of mind, right? And avoidance, which sometimes gets a too bad a rap, avoidance can be a constructive coping approach. If we're becoming very overwhelmed by something, it can be quite self-preservative and self-compassionate to give ourselves a chance to set it aside, allow ourselves to come back to feeling not overwhelmed before we try to tackle whatever it is. The problem is if we don't do the second part of that. Right? We put it aside and we try not to think about it. We not just temporarily, but try to avoid it. When we do that, it will come back. The decision will come back in front of us. Somebody will ask us, "What are you going to do about this? How do you feel about this?" We may have a deadline. We may feel pressure in various ways to choose. But now we're no closer to a decision because we haven't been thinking about it. So we're in the same exact place we were before we started, but now time has passed. And as time passes, very often pressure begins to rise because I've been thinking about this for days or weeks or months, and I still don't know what I want to do. And people expect me to make a decision, and I expect me to make a decision. And if I then avoid it, say, I'm going to put it out of mind again, right? Yet you end up with this terrible cycle of avoidance and feeling more, and the pressure builds and builds. So
Mm.
one of the things that people will sometimes do when they're stuck in that cycle is flip to the other side and make an impulsive decision. I'm just going to do something. I can't stand thinking about this anymore. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose X. And the thing about that is, for a minute, it feels good. It's like, oh, there's relief to it. All right, I've decided. But that's a classic situation in which we are typically half sure and half hearted.
Mm.
The impulsive
Yes.
decision is not one, right, where we've really decided thoughtfully and with consideration that on balance, this is how I want to be, and this feels right for me. And I haven't thought about how am I going to make this happen? How am I going to make the change or accomplish what I want to accomplish? And impulsive decisions most often lead to failure. Obstacles arise, it gets hard, we get tired, we get distracted, and we peter out. And we end up back stuck in the ambivalence again. Only now we're often starting to get angry at ourselves or disgusted with ourselves or blaming ourselves or feeling like there's something wrong with us or comparing ourselves to other people and saying, these people seem to be able to, what's wrong with me? And those kinds of thoughts, this self-blame, self-loathing, anger, reinforces the whole cycle we've just been talking about. Because if I'm feeling awful about myself, the first thing I want to do is not think about it. Let me try to avoid it, because that's terrible. If I don't think about the thing, I don't have to feel like such a failure or such a weak person or whatever it is I'm telling myself about myself. And then, of course, the avoidance doesn't last. And so it's this really painful cycle that people can get trapped in. And at that point, ambivalence has no benefits. You can't move forward constructively when you're in that kind of space or that kind of cycle.
Yes, it's really the sort of the depths of human suffering in a way. Once we're in that stuck point, where it was sort of avoidance leads to tension and pressure, leads to impulsivity, leads to failure, leads to shame, and then we're kind of in that sort of the loops of the mind where we're
right back. Exactly, right back to avoidance
yes,
or another
or even
impulsive
worse.
decision, or worse. Yeah,
Worse, yeah,
yeah,
because now we actually have all of that self-loathing and self-hating type self-talk going on, and we're
that's
feeling
right.
shame. And it does seem to me that the sort of shame is the last thing we want when it comes to feeling half sure but wholehearted. That it really erodes that commitment piece or that confidence, I suppose. In particular as
Both.
well.
Yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
mm.
And I guess self-trust. We
Okay.
don't talk a lot about
No.
self-trust in motivational interviewing in the theory, but it's actually a term that it's a construct that I find to be very important. And it really comes out of the work of Carl Rogers. It goes all the way back to the origins of MI. Because when you read Rogers talking about his understanding of, what is it we're trying to do when we sit down with the person and we're doing person-centered or client-centered counseling, and why does that help people? And I think his answer really comes down to, we begin to trust ourselves.
Mm,
We, instead of having references outside of ourselves for what's the right thing for me to do, what's the right way for me to be, am I a good enough person, am I worthy of love, uh, we access our internal sense of what Rogers, as you know, called the organismic tendency, which has often been Reframed as the self-actualizing tendency, the natural
Mm.
tendency we all have to move in the direction of growth and positive change and pro-social, caring behavior towards others and relational trust. Um, and when we lose that capacity to trust our own judgment, when we lose the capacity to believe we really do know what's right for us, we are able to make good decisions for ourselves, um, then we are lost. We're adrift, right? And we make decisions for all kinds of reasons that don't actually end up leading us along the path that we actually would want to go.
Mm. Yes, I've often probably thought of Rogers and that sense of acceptance or self-acceptance. But what you've said there really adds something to that. You know, the old saying, if I accept myself as I am, then I can change. It's sort of the paradox or whatever from Rogers. And it's actually also a little bit accepting oneself and trusting oneself and being able to trust that the wisdom that is there to make choices that are, in the service of our health and well-being, and being able to trust that in intrinsic wisdom that we
Yeah,
might have.
exactly. Exactly. And as what Rogers believed was that um, for a variety of reasons, mostly relating to messages we receive early in our life and really throughout our life, um, we very commonly lose that capacity or willingness to trust ourselves, or
Mm.
it becomes damaged or inhibited. And the messages that we take in are that we should trust what others think we should do or is right, or what others tell us makes us a good person or a worthwhile person. Um, and what's remarkable, and I have found remarkable in my work, and I'm quite sure you will have had many of these experiences in your work, um, with what happens when someone begins to receive consistently and without reservation a message of trust and belief in themselves. When I, as a practitioner, not just acceptance is an interesting word. It's the word Rogers used, of course, but I think its connotation is a lot weaker than he really meant it to be. It's really a deep prizing is the term that
Yes.
I am and that Rogers you talk about unconditional positive regard, which is a clunky term, and in some ways I think it's unfortunate that that's the term that came to be part of the theory, but he used other terms interchangeably with it, and he used the term prizing interchangeably with that word. And it's literally that the way that we all know what it's like to feel that and to feel it for someone else. If we've had children, or when your child brings you something they've made, and you look at it and you say that's beautiful, it's not. You're not pretending. You're not just saying it's beautiful when you really think you know, it. It's beautiful to you because your child made it, because it was something that they created. It came from them. It was their expression. Uh, and when you look at your child in that way through the eyes of love, the child experiences that being just for who they are, just for and how they are, and that in turn strengthens their ability to prize themselves.
Mm, mm. Yes, I've always
And
found that it's a funny one, that word, in a way, isn't it? Because it's also sort of moved a little bit out of our language in a way, sort of prizing things. And I often find in workshops, I mean, not to make it sort of you've been speaking in very profound terms, and now I'm going to make it sound a bit simplistic. But
no, no, yeah,
in workshops, I'll often talk about this notion of prizing, and people balk at it a little bit because then it sort of sounds a bit old
yeah,
worldy, but I think it does capture much more so what we're really what Rogers perhaps meant, or what we're trying to get to, that sort of pride beyond accepting it. It's a kind of a prizing of the person and their qualities and their strengths and the possibilities and the wisdom that they might bring to this, and really trying to convey or to create a conversation where the person really does connect with that self-trust,
yeah.
and start to prize themselves. Did Rogers mention the word ambivalence, or did he come at it in a different way? Or do you know what's the?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that he never used the word because
Yeah,
I can't say that I've read every line of Rogers. But um, in my reading of Rogers, I don't ever recall
yeah.
seeing that word. What's interesting is he also you almost never see him use the word autonomy either. He
Mm,
doesn't talk about. We use that term and it the sort of um, self-determination and valuing of the self-determination, self-governance, literally autonomos, to govern oneself
mm,
in the other person, is something that's very much a part of our language today.
mm.
Rogers didn't really use it, but everything he talked about was
Yes.
all about that, but the term wasn't there. Um, and I think I don't know. I mean, this might be a sidetrack, but my hunch as to why Rogers might not have talked about ambivalence is that he was less focused on. I think we tend, as practitioners of motivational interviewing, to think about things in terms of people are facing choices, difficult choices, and we're trying to help them essentially decide, which path to follow, which direction to go in, which path to follow. And I don't think Rogers thought about his work that way. I think he thought about it much more in terms of, I'm here just to offer an empathic, prizing, and genuine presence. And then whatever happens, I have full faith that whatever is going to happen as a result of that, or whatever the client is going to do, or is going to be right for them, is going to be their path.
Mm.
Um, and so it really wasn't thinking so much about making decisions or resolving internal conflicts, although that was obviously the effect
Yes.
of I think of what he was doing. But I don't think he conceptualized his work that way.
No, but it is interesting to because the one of the great things about Rogers was he videoed himself and used a lot of that sort of
That's right.
both research and teaching and so on, and yes, you can sort of see him doing it still. He's creating that environment and that relationship and that conversation where people are weighing things up in a sense, and
Yeah.
in the Gloria tapes, for example.
And resolving ambivalence. Exactly.
Yes,
I think we
exactly.
would certainly say people are resolving ambivalence. Well, yeah, I don't think he was conceptualizing it that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's an interesting little segue. But yes, you did mention the benefits of ambivalence, and this is an area that you've been really thinking about, and I think gets a bit forgotten or neglected. So, what are some of the benefits
Mhm.
really of ambivalence?
Yeah. So this is an area that I think it's really over the past couple of decades that researchers have been digging into this question. And I think of the research largely started with thinking about ambivalence the way we have traditionally thought about it in MI, that it's this unpleasant state, that people need help in resolving it, that people have a tendency when they're ambivalent to try to stop being ambivalent as quickly as possible in whatever way they can. But what began to emerge were there are at least two main ways, I think, that ambivalence can be helpful to us. One is that it serves as a signal to slow down. When I was just talking about getting caught in that cycle of anxiety and avoidance, right, and impulsiveness and so on, the common factor, the common thread to all of that is that it's reactive. I feel bad, I feel anxious or uncomfortable, and so I just try to push it aside. Or it comes back, and so now let me just do something. And this realization has really been informed by research in the structure on our cognitive structures and thinking, the way we think. And there's a number of theories of this. Probably the best known was developed by these two. They came to be, behavioral economists, Tversky and Kahneman. They were actually Israeli psychologists who did a lot of research on things like bias and bias thinking, and where do these biases come from, and why do we fall into making thinking errors that we're actually capable of not falling into, and yet we all do it on a regular basis. And their answer was that there's essentially two different thought patterns, they called them system 1 and system 2. And the book that Kahneman published was called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a great book. It's a really thick, dense book. It's not light reading. But it turned into a bestseller in the States, which I thought was amazing. I think people bought it and then didn't read it because but the basic idea is that we have these two parallel thinking structures. The system 1 is the system that we rely on day to day, and it's perfectly fine, right? It's the system we rely on to make decisions about, when we go sit down, at a restaurant or for breakfast, do I have eggs or pancakes, or it's decisions that are small, not hugely important, don't necessarily have a right or wrong answer, and that are very familiar to us. And so we solve these problems with what they called heuristics, rules of thumb. Really shortcuts to thinking. And the thing about this system is that for most of our decisions, it works perfectly fine. It's all we need. If you had to stop and think and really cogitate about every decision you made, and of course there are folks who get caught in that, and it's not right, you couldn't live your life. Right? So we have this wonderful system 1 that's good enough. We rely on it most of the time, and it gets us by. And sometimes we make mistakes and we make wrong assumptions as a result of it, but they're not big decisions, so it doesn't hurt us very much. But there are certain kinds of decisions that can't effectively be made through the use of heuristics, shortcuts, right? That really require slow thinking. System 2 thinking is one thing. And this is the kind of thinking that we need to do when we have a new problem, it's a new situation. Familiar situations we can almost always solve with system 1 because we already have a solution that we just pull out. New challenges, new problems, new decisions, and decisions that are really important in our life that are going to have a major impact. Whatever we decide, it's going to really have consequences. And the trap that we can fall into is relying on system 1 thinking when we should be accessing system two.
Mm.
And that is what ambivalence does for us when it's working for us. Ambivalence is a signal that we need to shift over into slower thinking.
Mm.
That we're facing a problem that or a situation that's novel, it's unfamiliar to us. We don't necessarily know what the right answer is. We may not have all the information we need to be able to even answer the question. And that information, I don't mean only facts, but information about ourselves and about people we care about and how they would feel. And so that's one major benefit. When we slow down, when ambivalence tells us, oh, I need to slow down, we can do a whole series of things that will help us make the decision more effectively. In other words, ambivalence is a signal to pause. Don't try to solve this now. Don't try to come to a decision right away. And you don't have to. So it's permission to pause. It's permission to slow down instead of feeling pressure to make a choice to do it right now.
Mm.
So that's one benefit. Once we slow down, we can access our creativity. We can access our ability to explore different possibilities in our own thoughts, but also with people we trust, people who know us well or who have perspectives and ways of thinking that we value. We can seek more information. We can realize, you know what? There's stuff I don't know about this, about if I make this choice versus that choice. There's a lot I don't know about what will follow. I wonder if I could find out more. How could I find out more? Let me take some time to do some real research on that.
Mm. Mm.
And all of that can help us make a decision in a way that allows us to feel like we can be half
Mm.
sure but wholehearted.
And you can sort of see where tolerance or even courage comes in at that point, because that's where you get the natural feelings arise as well of discomfort about pausing and slowing down and giving proper consideration. And so, yeah, the tolerance and even courage perhaps kicks in at that point.
I think you're absolutely right, Stan. I think uh, uh, it really and it's an interesting. I want to say it's an interesting thing that it takes courage. Um,
Mm.
I think the fact that it takes courage is partly due to the kinds of societies in which we live, the cultures in which we live, the cultural expectations that we tend to feel if we're living in Western quote unquote societies, uh, is that you should know your own mind. You should be able to make decisions. You should, time is money. You need to
Yeah.
keep move right. You know, uh, Impatience, all those sorts of things. And I think that's part of what generates that pressure that we feel. And so to slow down and be thoughtful, to defer the decision, to say, you know what, I need to take some time before I can give you an answer, actually is a little bit countercultural. It requires going against a lot of the expectations that we feel from the people around us, sometimes in our lives, certainly in our work lives, very often as well. But I think you're absolutely right. It does take courage, and it does also take being willing, especially to tolerate some discomfort,
Yeah.
and to know that I can be uncomfortable, but it's not going to overwhelm me. It's not going to be so uncomfortable that I can't stand it.
Mm.
I can hold a certain amount of indecision, uncertainty, tension. And doing that will allow me to get to the point where I'm making a decision that I actually feel good about
Mm. Mm.
and that I can feel confident in and I can trust.
Mm. Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think
So that,
all of that, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yes,
Believe it or
it's
not,
sort
that's
of.
only one of the benefits. I'll talk about the
Oh,
other one, but please
I
go
was
ahead.
I was going to
Yeah, no.
say that the first one, yes, is slow us down, gives us permission to slow down, which I think is really an important angle there from what you were saying, and also takes that sort of distress tolerance and perhaps even courage to do so.
Yes.
And there was a second area of benefit.
Yeah. And I will say that, you know, the just because the term distress tolerance, which is so key, the obvious sort of correlate is for when we're helping folks who struggle with that, those are the sorts of interventions that can really help people get out of the trap of avoidance and anxiety and self-criticism and impulsivity and all of that, right? So we can do things to help people be able to tolerate and access their own capacity to tolerate that uncertainty, distress, ambivalence. So that's I think that's a crucial part. The other benefit, it's not completely distinct, but it's related. The first benefit is really very cognitive, right? It's about thinking and decision making. The other benefit is really more emotional. And there's research that shows that people who are willing and able to experience ambivalence actually show a greater level of resilience in the face of stress and emotional coping, which of course is all associated with greater well-being and all the things that we all would like to feel. And I'll give you my favorite example for this is from work that I did some years ago with a researcher who was developing a new therapy for what we called at the time complicated grief, which is now known as prolonged grief disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I think in the ICD as well, but we used to call it complicated grief. Complicated grief is briefly a condition in which a person many, not just months, but often many years after they have lost someone, feels as though they're in the exact same place they were in the hours and days after the loss.
Mm.
With grief, we have these wonderful, adaptive capacities that we all celebrate. And one of them, grief, is one of those. The capacity to grieve is, we don't have to do grief work. Grief works in us.
Mm-hmm.
If we allow it to, when we grieve, when we first lose somebody and we're in that acute kind of state of grief, of course, the most prominent feelings are all painful feelings: sadness, the yearning for the person, fear or anxiety about how am I going to manage without them, loneliness, all the sorts of things that we all know, sadness that we associate with grief. What it turns out, what actually happens most of the time is that as time passes, it's not that those feelings disappear. When we lose somebody who's important to us, we may always feel sadness about the loss, but it goes from being right here all the time, front and center, the only thing we can focus on, to being more in the background, more something
Mm.
that we can live with. And a lot of that has to do with knowing that we continue to carry that person in our heart. So when grief works, we go from feeling we've lost this person completely to feeling like we've lost them, and at the same time, we haven't
Mm.
completely lost them. They are still with us in important ways. People who struggle with complicated grief don't experience that. For them, the grief stays acute, no matter how much time passes.
Mm.
And the reason I brought this up in the context of our conversation about ambivalence is that acute grief, as much as the painful feelings are most prominent, it turns out that those are not the only feelings that people have, even when they're acutely grieving. And you know this if you've lost someone, or if you've known someone who lost someone, and you went to a funeral home or a visitation. In the Jewish faith, it's Shiva, which is sort of conducted in the home for 7 days, a mourning period. Whatever tradition or faith tradition or culture, all have some version of this. When you go there, if you listen to the conversations that are happening, you'll certainly hear you'll hear people crying, you'll hear sadness, you'll hear tears, but you'll also hear moments of laughter, or you see people smiling. And what you realize is that almost always what's happening is that someone has just told a story about the person who died. And it's a story about something unique and special about how they were, that makes all of us smile or even laugh. That was so them. And so even in acute grief, when its grief is working, you have moments of those being in touch with the warm feelings for the person you lost, the joy they brought into your life, the gratitude you feel for having had them and for the time you had, right? And the balance is usually very much lots of pain and only moments, but it's the balance that changes over time as grief moves from acute into integrating grief. But and that's ambivalence.
Mm-hmm.
The
Emotionally.
ability, emotional ambivalence, to be able to hold both of those kinds of feelings and not tell yourself, I shouldn't be smiling. It's wrong for me to laugh for a moment. But to know this is actually what this is the human response to losing someone we loved. We feel a whole lot of hurt and sad and painful feelings, and also an awareness of warmth and joy and gratitude. And it's a pretty good predictor. If a person can't hold that ambivalence, can't experience both of those things during acute grief, their risk of ending up with complicated or prolonged grief is very, very high. So being able to hold the ambivalence allows us the processing time to work through over time, both accepting the loss and figuring out how we go on with life. And a big part of that, how we go on, is with the knowledge that we continue to carry that person in our heart. And the memories and the love that we shared is something we will always have. So both in a cognitive and an emotional way, the capacity to hold and tolerate ambivalence turns out to be really beneficial.
Yeah, I right at the beginning of our conversation, you made that really important point that ambivalence is part thinking and part feeling, and to remind us that we're thinking about, or we're sort of exploring ambivalence on both those fronts, and benefits arise on both those fronts. If we're able to have that tolerance to the feeling and the discomfort around the ambivalence, then that's what it offers us, is something about the thoughts and feelings that we might, the mixed thoughts and feelings that we might have about whatever this particular topic might be.
Exactly. It's a little bit like the difference between being really constrained and narrowed in your thinking and feeling versus having access to a much wider range of thoughts and feelings. And with access to that whole range of thoughts and feelings, and not criticizing or judging ourselves for having them, allowing ourselves to, the Whitman line, I'm large, I contain multitudes.
Yes.
To believe that about ourselves, and to know that when we're ambivalent, that's all that is. It's a manifestation of that aspect of what it means to be a human being.
Mm,
If we can have access to all that, we can use all of it.
mm,
We can tap into it. We can pull it into our decision making. We can know that even though right now I'm feeling, the sad and painful part of this, I also have warm and positive feelings, and those are still there, even if they're not immediately present to me. And
mm,
I'm not going to be just stuck in the pain, right?
mm,
Uh,
mm.
and I can also allow those feelings to inform my decision. I mean, the funny thing about feelings, there's been this long battle, I'm sure you know, a battle may be too strong a word, but in psychology, between the sort of cognitive model of emotions, the cognitive therapy proponents and the emotion focused therapy proponents. And of course, like most battles, what we really need is an integration, right?
Yes.
There's a dialectic that we try to accomplish, but there's this question of, so is it the thoughts? Are feelings just sort of an offshoot of thoughts? They're like, in philosophy, there's a term epiphenomena. The things that happen, but they don't actually have any consequences or effect. Or are feelings important information? And I think, we certainly come down on the side of believing that feelings are important information, right? That when we feel a certain way, it tells us something about what we value, about what our experience is of a situation or a person. If we mistrust our feelings, if we judge those feelings, if we try to ignore them, we're depriving ourselves of a rich source of information that can help us figure out, well, what is it that I really want to do next? Where
Mm,
do I feel good and where do I feel not so good? Not where do I think I should feel good? What do I think I should want or should feel or should like? But what actually feels good when I move towards it? What
mm,
actually gives me a sense of purpose or accomplishment or value or closeness, the things that we, or independence and autonomy, the things that we value at the core. Um, and paying attention to those feelings, we shouldn't only rely on our feelings, right? Any more than we should only rely on our thought. But if we can hold and integrate all of that, that's going to give us our best capacity to come to a decision about what's right for us. Which direction do we want to go
And it's just occurred to me out of all of that, and I'll ask one more biggish question, and then I'll let you go because you've given us so much wonderful time. But it sort of makes me think that a third benefit of ambivalence, or at least being able to sit with that ambivalence and explore it, is being able to understand this notion of horizontal versus vertical ambivalence. That if we
in?
stay there and we think about our various ways we think or feel about this thing that we're considering, that some of the perhaps more unconscious aspects of that, or the things that are outside of our awareness, might kind of bubble up into awareness. I think I just quoted Carl Rogers there. Actually, he says something like that. But yeah, I mean, I know it's another big topic, but
Mhm.
perhaps vertical ambivalence starts to come in at this point too.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for bringing that up because it's an area, it's a concept that I also find really really interesting. And um, essentially, when we're experiencing vertical ambivalence, it often means we're ambivalent. Either we're ambivalent and we don't know that we're ambivalent, or we're ambivalent or indecisive and we don't know why we're ambivalent or indecisive.
Hmm.
So let me give an example of this. Uh, that's not, you know, well, okay, that's not too complicated because I can always
Mm.
go into the complicated ones, but I'll spare you and your and those listening and viewing that level. Um, so many of us in motivational interviewing, of course, use an activity or an exercise known as the values card sort. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's a it's a really simple tool. It's just a stack of cards, and each card has a value word on it, something that might be important to a person. And in this activity, we give the person who we're trying to help this stack of cards, and it could be 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, because there's lots of different things that we can value or care about. We give the person the stack and we ask them to sort the cards. And there are different ways that different practitioners have. My approach is to ask people first to sort into two piles: not important to me and important to me. So the simplest distinction, just kind of let's get rid of the ones that you don't care about, and then take the important to me pile and sort it into important and the ones that are most important. And usually, if I'm doing this, I'll ask the person to limit themselves to five, no more than five. Because if it gets more than that, then it no longer. So we're trying to get at the core values that the person has, the things that really are most central for them, right? So we have people do this card sort, and then we talk with them about the values, and I'll say a little bit about how we do that. But that activity was the first time I was ever introduced to that activity was almost 25 years ago now, and it was at a meeting of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers in 2000. And Bill Miller came in and he demonstrated it for us. It was something he'd been doing, and somebody had heard about it, and we asked him to come in, and so he did. And so we asked one of us to volunteer to be the person doing the values cards, and one of us was willing to volunteer. The volunteer sorted the cards, and I can't remember all of the most important values, but there were two. One of them was health, and one of them was adventure. And the topic that he had been struggling with, he was quitting smoking. And when he was asked, what he said was, I'm a healthcare provider. I'm very committed to helping people live healthier behaviors. I live a very healthy life in many different ways. And yet I am a smoker, and I've been smoking for 20 years and I've never been able to stop. And it distresses me and confuses me that I've not been able to stop, because it feels so inconsistent with everything else about who I am and what I do. But there it is. I've tried. I can never give it up. And so he went through the card sort, and Bill Miller asked him, tell me about each of these values. Just tell me what they mean to you. And the health one he'd already talked about a lot, because that was part of the introduction to the conversation. He said, well, the thing is about adventure is I used to do a lot of adventurous things. I did a lot of camping, and I was somebody who really did a lot of, I used to ride motorcycles. I did a lot of things that were, sort of a little bit risky, but I loved that. And the truth is that my life has become so busy and so many other things that I really have very little of that in my life anymore. And as he was saying this, and I can remember this vividly now, 25 years later, you could see a change come over his face. And he then said, the only remnant of that adventurous life was his smoking cigarettes.
Mm.
It's the only thing I'd still do. And I didn't have the language for it then, but I now understand that to be a beautiful illustration of vertical ambivalence.
Mm.
He knew he wanted to quit smoking. He had all kinds of good reasons to quit smoking, things he disliked about it. He didn't think there was anything he liked about it. He didn't think there was anything on the status quo side of the ambivalence. You think about change versus status quo. It was only in that moment that he realized that there was this huge this huge benefit for him connected to one of his deepest values. And, in that moment, what he was able to say is, well, no wonder I never quit smoking because,
Mm.
how could I give up the only thing that's an expression of something that's so important to me?
Mm. Mm.
So I think there are times when, and this is the way I've come to think about this, when I'm working with people, especially who have already been doing a lot of work, a lot of exploration of their ambivalence, trying things, um, and believe that they know what they want to do and find themselves somehow not doing it. One of the things I'm now on the lookout for is this kind of vertical ambivalence,
Mm.
is a question of, is there something in the behavior that they're doing now that they're not even aware of being valuable to them in the way that it is, beneficial to them in the way that it is? Um, and if I have that question, it's not the only thing that could be going on, but it's one of the most I find the most reliable things I will find in a situation like that. And what I will then do is, what we've been taught to be very careful about doing in motivational interviewing, which is I will ask them to talk about what they like, what they value about the way things are now,
Mm.
and what's
Mm.
important to them about it,
Mm.
and really explore it. And I might actually use the values card sort as a way of getting into that, because very often we don't know what we don't know. And the nice thing about the values cards is that we see it in black and white. We may not think, oh, this is really important, but we see it in black and white. Oh, actually, you know what? That is something that is important to me. Let me put that in the important pile, and maybe that's something we need to talk about. Um, but I think the nice thing about this is that in most cases, um, if the question that you should ask, or that I ask, is, so what kept it vertical? Why did the benefit of the status quo disappear? Right? Why didn't he know that he was still smoking because of that? And I think the answer is because it was so incongruent. It was a conflict of values.
Yes.
And at some level, either without realizing it, he, the old term, of course, would be repressed it. He pushed it out of awareness or stopped paying attention to it. And I think
Mm.
we can do that sometimes when we have an ambivalence, not just about, do I want to quit smoking or drinking or take this job or take that job or change the way I treat, but when it's a conflict not only of, pros and cons, but a conflict of values, especially a conflict of core values, things that are both central to us and yet seem to be in conflict with each other. I think one of our defenses, our ways of protecting ourselves, or trying to ease the pain of not being able to square the circle, reconcile this conflict, is putting one side of it out of mind
Mm.
and trying to persuade or convince ourselves, or just neglecting it. So we're no longer even really aware that it's something that matters to us.
It's such a challenge when two equally good and legitimate values are in conflict with each other. It puts us in a very complicated place. And it sort of reminds me, though, that example that you gave, it's a little bit like, sort of relying on system one thinking in a way, because of course he's very familiar with health and health sorts of reasons and needs for change, or those sorts of things, because he does it all day in his
It's
job and so on. So that's like
it's what's
system
most
one.
accessible. Exactly. That's
Very
right. That's
accessible,
exactly.
easy to,
Yeah.
familiar, kind of defaulting to it. And for lots of situations, it probably works quite well. But to be able to shift to the system two thinking, which slows it down, allows some of these other conflicts or outside of awareness kinds of issues to just have time, really, and also attention
To bubble
to
up.
to to come up and
To
and to
to bubble up and be paid attention to. Exactly right. Exactly,
yes,
Stan. Yeah.
yeah. So it's
I love
it,
that. And it's a beautiful example because, of course, what he realized almost as soon as he said it was, well, there are other ways I can introduce adventure back into
adventure.
my life.
Mm,
The value wasn't smoking, right? The value was adventure. So, smoking had become associated with that, and it became the one easy. Didn't take any time. It didn't require him to make any other changes. It was automatic. All the same things you were just saying. So somehow it kind of became the thing that represented that missing piece in his life. But as soon as he slowed down and became aware that that's what it was, it would be very easy to start. Now, of course, easy to realize doesn't mean it was going to be easy to reintroduce adventure into his life. The reason adventure disappeared from his life was because it became challenging for all the things, being busy and having other things and other commitments. But decide, now being in a position to decide, is it worth it to me to figure out a way to build in something else into my life that will give me that feeling of adventure that is such a core part of who I am, and what I like about myself, and what makes me feel good.
mm,
Now it's a choice that I can make, uh, and what seemed to be a dilemma, it's either smoking or health, was really a false dilemma after all. It was
mm,
really it's I could do adventurous things that don't threaten my health,
mm, mm.
and I
Yeah.
can have both of those things. I could be a healthy person who exercises, eats well, encourages others to take good care of themselves, and do things that are exciting.
Mm.
And it doesn't have to be a contradiction at all. That's the dialectic to bring our whole conversation now full circle, which I didn't realize it was going to do. So thank you for bringing
Yeah.
this in, vertical ambivalence in, because it's the perfect sort of illustration of that. That's the dialectical moment. We think it's an either or, but it's really not. There's a
Mm,
third term, there's a solution that allows us to bring those two things together and to have both in a way that we can feel good about.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You, uh, you have this book, Alan, and I
I
won't call
do.
it I won't call it brilliant because you're too humble for that, but even though it is, and
Thanks.
I just wanted to
See,
sort of,
you can see your viewers are seeing my face go red. I am somebody who wears my heart on my sleeve, as you can see. As I,
yes, no, sorry about that, but I just wanted to
all
remind
right, I
you
don't
that
mind.
when I've had it for several years now, but when I got it, you wrote in it to stand in the spirit of compassion that animates us all. So I thought that was a pretty good, a good little inscription. But this particular book, I mean, it's very practical. It gives us lovely kind of case studies or examples of people who are doing
Mhm.
just this, trying to work through ambivalence. Your thinking has evolved and grown and developed in terms of ambivalence. I think that's maybe 10 years old now, that particular book or
Yeah,
something like that. Um,
yeah,
but
exactly.
I thought we might just finish on like what might be, I don't know whether it's top three or sort of what might be a little collection of things that you could leave with people who are thinking through ambivalence and who are feeling ambivalent about something, and something that's
Sure,
just a little practical takeaway for people.
sure. Happy to. And I would say one that my thinking certainly has evolved, uh, but there's nothing that I wrote in that book that I don't still believe to be true. I
Mm.
think it's more that there are things that I've been able to add and extend, that I've come to understand in the time since I wrote it. So I think for me, it still represents a very solid guide for how I think about how people can, work through, resolve ambivalence, or be helped to do that. Second thing is I'll try to be brief and I'll try to be practical. That's not always my strong suit, as you know. But yes, let me give you a few thoughts. Um, One is we've already talked about that the first key is almost always going to be to recognize the pressure that you're feeling or that you've been putting on yourself. If you're stuck in ambivalence, is almost, I mean, virtually certain that if you've been struggling with ambivalence for a period of time, that you are feeling a lot of the things we've been talking about in our conversation: the pressure, the self-criticism, although maybe the wanting to avoid, wanting to leap into, and to start from that sort of permission, that recognition that the only way to get yourself unstuck is to take that pressure off, to find a way to relieve the pressure. And there are a lot of ways to do that. And many of the things that you and your other guests talk about on this podcast when it comes to self-compassion are the exact tools that people can use to take that pressure off of themselves. Right? That sort of pressure is the opposite of self-compassion, and finding ways to be more compassionate towards yourself, I think is crucial. And I think we could do that. There are concrete ways of doing that. And I'll just mention a few. We know that self-affirmation is a crucial and very powerful method for helping people open up and tolerate ambivalence instead of being in that cycle of trying to avoid it or get rid of it, and so on. And then if we had another hour, we could talk for a whole hour about the literature on research on self-affirmation and these very brief interventions that have really remarkable effects. The most amazing effect, and I'll just mention it, that I've come across, is researchers had done several studies to help women lose weight. And they went back to these women who had been in the study a couple of years later. And no, wait, no, yeah, it was well after. I'm not sure exactly how long. They went back after the studies, and they randomly either did a 5-minute self-affirmation activity or did not.
Mm.
Half of them got it, half of them did not, and that was the randomization. 2.5 years, more than 2 years after that 5-10-minute max self-affirmation activity, the women who'd gotten the self-affirmation activity had maintained their weight loss far more consistently than the women who had not.
Hmm.
So a 10-minute activity had an impact more than 2 years later. So the power of these kinds of self-affirming, self-compassionate activities is remarkable how much a little can do. Mm. And so the way they do these in these studies is actually related to the values card sort, which is they ask people to identify. They usually give people just a short list of values, and they ask people to identify, to put them in rank order, which of these values is most and least important to you. And then they ask them to write for 5 minutes about the value that they chose as most important to them. That's it. That's the whole activity. Sometimes they'll give a little more guidance, write about the value, why it's important to you, what it means to you. They might invite people, as I did in the book, to say, how, talk about a time when you lived that value out in your life, when you felt good about that value. But some version of that instruction, do that for 5 minutes, has been shown to be really have remarkable effects. So self-affirmation activities, which is different from saying positive things to yourself. Positive self-talk can, I think, sometimes for some people be effective. I'll admit it's not my favorite activity. When I try to talk to myself in positive ways, I tend to not doubt myself. It's
Argue
like,
back.
oh yeah, I argue back. So and so if you happen to be with somebody who does that, the values activity is great, because you're not making an argument about anything. You're just talking about what do I care about, and why do I care about it? What makes this so important to me? There's another activity that is that you and I talked about another time, on a safe space imagery. It's an activity that invites people to identify imaginally a place where they feel safe and calm and secure, where they have in the past felt that way. So not a place I've never been to, but to actually root it in some place they have been at any point in their life where they had that feeling of safety. And then invites the person to elaborate on that imaginal moment. So it's things like really going through all the senses. So, tell me what you see as you look around this place, as you imagine it. What do you feel? You feel anything on your skin? Are there any smells? Are there any sounds? And just making it as real and concrete as possible. And once the person is able to conjure, to sort of get to that imaginal place, it becomes something that they can call up again whenever they need it. So some way of self-affirming, self-calming, all of these things help take pressure off of us, rather than trying to pressure ourselves, not telling ourselves, stop being so pressured, right? Because we know what happens when we do that. When we make demands of ourselves, we feel it as another form of pressure, and it backfires. But other things that just help us feel more self-accepting, more self-compassionate, more self-affirming. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing, another concrete thing we can do is allow ourselves to identify really quickly, am I ambivalent because I'm not sure what I want to do, what the right choice is for me? Am I ambivalent because I'm not sure if I can do what I want to do? Or is it both? And as you know, in motivational interviewing, we think about ambivalence as having two dimensions, importance and confidence. And we do activities with people. The easiest way to do this is actually with a ruler. And you can do this yourself. If you imagine a scale from 0 to 10, and ask yourself, on a scale from 0 to 10, if 0 is not important to me at all and 10 was the most important thing, how important is it to me right now to make this change? And again, not how important do I feel it should be, or not how important is that are others people telling me it should be. But if I just ask myself, honestly, nobody else is going to know, it's just between me and me, how important is it to me right now to do this? And just write down the number. And then using that same 0 to 10 scale, on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is not confident at all and 10 is completely confident, how confident am I that if I decided to try to make this change, that I would be able to succeed? And just write down the number. Now, there are things you could do to go further with this activity, but just that step can be sometimes quite revelatory, because sometimes people, when they're stuck in ambivalence, the reason they're stuck is not that they don't know what they want to do. they're actually pretty sure about what they would like to do. It's that they have real doubts about being able to do it, that
Mm.
they have either the skills or the capacity, or others will allow them to, or the environment will make it possible. There's a whole lot of reasons why we may have a lower confidence. Um, but just distinguishing, because the thing is, if I'm trying to resolve ambivalence by thinking about what's most important to me and what do I really want, when that's not really the source of my stuckness at all, then I'm just going to keep spinning my wheels. If I realize that what's keeping me stuck is really much, and here's a simple way of finding this out, by the way. Let's imagine you're somebody who said, well, um, it's a 5 or a 6 for importance, and it's a 2 for confidence. If I ask you this question, imagine that we were able to come up with resources and ways so that you would genuinely feel that your confidence was like an 8 or a 9 rather than a 2. Imagine your confidence could somehow miraculously be an 8 or a 9. How important would it be for you right now to make this change? And very often, if it's an issue of low confidence, first the person will say a higher number than they said 2 minutes earlier when they
Mm.
were asked to rate the importance.
Mhm.
Phenomenon of false low importance is
Oh,
a well-established phenomenon. And there's actually research that shows it. Sorry, I can't help but get into, everything I talk about, I try to make sure I'm not just talking out of my hat. There's actually research that shows, and it's all about preserving our positive self-views.
yes.
If we feel that there's something really important for us to do or some way we want to be and don't believe we can be that way, it's quite painful.
Mm.
And so part of what we might do is persuade ourselves that we really don't want to be that way at all.
Mm.
So just identifying what's my need right now? Do I need help figuring out what's really right for me? What do I believe would be the best path for me to take? Or do I need help feeling like I am capable of taking the steps that I would take if I felt I could? Just separating those two can often help people figure out, where do I need help? What's my next step in this process? You can't solve the wrong problem. You try to solve the problem that's not the problem you have, you're never going to solve it, right?
Mm.
So that, I think, is a useful thing to do. Um, and then the third thing is the values process, the access to values. The really nice thing about values activities is that it does double duty. It does tend to help us feel better about ourselves, as long as, by the way, we don't want to be thinking about, when we're doing it for self-affirmation purposes, we don't want to be doing it in the same area as the thing we're ambivalent about, because that will tend to trigger negative feelings about ourselves. So we want to think about something we value that's separate from whatever it is we're ambivalent about. Um, so doing that can be a self-affirming activity. It can put us in touch with what we feel good about in ourselves and our sense of trust in ourselves. It can also help guide us when we can't quite figure out what's the right decision or choice for us. And it's another way in which we often rely on system one instead of system two thinking and get in trouble for that. We try to pile up what are the pros and cons of making, and the pros and cons are all relatively superficial, or we don't realize that some of them weigh a lot more than the others. So I might have 5 pros and 1 con, but that 1 con weighs much more than all the pros, and so, or vice
Mm.
versa. So paying attention to what really matters most to us, and what would I be doing if I were trying to take steps to live out what matters most to me? What choices would I be making? Set aside whether I feel like I can. Don't put pressure on yourself to do it. That's a separate issue. but just asking yourself, if I could, what is the thing that matters most to me, and what direction would I move in if I were moving in a way that was guided by that value, that was most in tune with or aligned with that value?
Mm.
And often what happens in that situation is people can recognize what it is. And then sometimes they realize, wow, that made my decision very simple. I mean, I've been going around in circles, but I actually know exactly what I want to do.
Mm.
And sometimes helps people realize is, oh no, yeah, yes, I know that's my value, and I know that's what I would want, and I'm just so afraid that I can't do it, or I'm not going to be good enough, and that's where, again, that tells me where I need help, what I need to focus on to get myself unstuck. It's
Mm.
not about. So either way, um,
Mm.
the piece about that value, the interesting thing when people have that experience, it's quite remarkable. Um, and where I encountered this, another area, was in work I was doing with living organ donation. I've worked in a lot of different areas, all related to MI in my career. It's part of what's made my career so enjoyable for me is how many different ways you can figure out how can MI help here. People who donate a kidney or part of their liver while they're still alive, right? No, not after death. Most often when they do it, or sometimes even bone marrow, they're donating to a loved one. And the really interesting thing about that decision is that the vast majority of people who make that decision tell you that it wasn't a decision. They never experienced themselves as deciding or feeling ambivalent at all.
Mm.
Somebody said to them, you're a match, your kidney is a match for this person. Would you be willing, or would you be willing to find out if you're a match? And if so, to donate? And they immediately said, of course I would. Because if it's your child, or if it's your spouse, or it's most of the people who are doing it, it doesn't feel like a decision at all. And the reason it doesn't feel like a decision is because the core value is immediately salient. It's the thing that's right in front of me. Right? I don't have I don't have to do a lot of thinking about what are the pros and cons of how this might, the thing that matters most to me in my life, this person who I love, I can literally save their life. Do I want to do that? I mean, what kind of question is that? Right. And so I think it's less dramatic when you do the values activity and people identify the value than that, but it's along the same continuum. I think when people are able to clear away all the trivia and the chaff, get in touch with the thing that they really care about the most, that matters most to them, and ask themselves that question, it can be very clarifying.
Mm.
So I think those are just some, I mean, of the
Beautiful.
things
Yeah.
that I think people can try.
Yeah, I think one, take the pressure off and maybe open up to the benefits of ambivalence. Two, explore both importance and confidence for change, as well as the thoughts and feelings around importance and confidence. And then really access values and not only, well, to both affirm, but also to guide, I guess. And I really take your point. Sometimes identifying those values, that's the moment where people are really moved towards change. Um, and it sort of does often seem like a kind of important moment. But yeah, look, that's been really fabulous. I have always appreciated how you think and how you draw on, the research, the philosophy, your own kind of way of conceptualizing people and the world. And so I really have had lots of food for thought today for myself and my own practice, but sort of thinking things through. So Dr. Allan Zuckoff, thank you for joining me on Compassion in a T-shirt.
Stan, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for in allowing and indulging my somewhat long-winded and verbose thinking, and it's been a real pleasure.